Many years ago, when Dr. Kirit Joshi, who was the registrar of the Sri Aurobindo Ashram's school, had organized an exhibition of the spiritual history of humanity, he culminated the exhibition with the place of Sri Aurobindo. On being informed of the structure of this exhibition, the mother said to him, Sri Aurobindo is not the culmination of the past. He is the beginning of a new future. It's something to dwell upon because a very simple, brief statement opens us to extraordinary insights. When we look back at the journey of evolution, not just the human, but all evolution of the earth, looking back at the evidence of archaeology, going back millions, perhaps billions of years, we find a fascinating pattern. Repeatedly, there have been as if sudden dramatic extinctions of forms of life. And immediately after, an enormous dramatic flowering of new species of plants and animals. And again, a long period in which these new species evolve, rather gradually, and then suddenly an extinction in which something like at least 75% of species is wiped out. And again, a new efflorescence of new forms, new species, and again a reasonably gradual further unfolding, again and again and again. The best of our scientific understanding of evolution does not explain this pattern. For that, we have to go deeper. The prime driver of evolution is not random chance or survival of the fittest. The prime driver of evolution is something much more profound. That which is the most profound initiator of impulse, which makes this whole universe possible. The very creative impulse of the divine will, the divine vision, the divine delight, which is seated within us as the divine soul, but also within all things as the divine spark. This divine underlying presence within everything, in every living being, in every living plant, in every stone and form and atom and subatomic particle, as a divine spark, it pushes, nudges. And when everywhere in the universe there is this constant nudge, push, eventually over time these things combine, these pushes coalesce to form something. A form emerges. Events happen. Sometimes they are dramatic, sometimes they are gradual, but with dramatic outcomes. We see the results, we are blind to this underlying cause. Because the thing that pushes here in this atom is the same in every atom. It's the same one divine presence, the same one divine will, pushing from every little point in the whole universe. And therefore, tiny nudges everywhere at the same time can as if coalesce to form a dramatic outcome. And when you try to trace back your dramatic outcome, it fizzles out into so many little causes, none of which in itself would have been sufficient for this outcome. And so the prime driver of evolution, we must understand, is hidden. It is in everything, equally. It pushes from within everything, differently, but with equal purpose. Once we recognize this, we notice the next step is this sustained push, impulse, drive, which in the Veda is described as Agni, the divine will seated in matter deep within, cowled, covered in darkness, sometimes hiding itself. And yet this sustained push builds a pressure. The pressure within us grows, and there is a pressure because although the will pushes, the form which holds the will resists. That's the nature of form. If form was pliable, it would not be formed. The universe would collapse because it was too soft. The rigidity of the form resists, the will pushes, and over time, days, weeks, years, centuries, millennia, it builds pressure until eventually either the form yields, sometimes suddenly, sometimes gradually, or it breaks. If it cannot change enough, it breaks. But the will pushing continues. It continues, and if the old form breaks, it builds new forms. If the old form yields and becomes something new, it continues now further. It continues to push towards what? The very nature of that push, the will within, is something that sees. It knows, yes, this is what I must be. This is what I must become because this is what I am. It looks and pushes, pushes, pushes with a steady gaze on the goal. Recognizing this, we can also accept the certainty of the eventual goal. But in between, periods of pressure building, yielding in forms, changes in forms, gradual, sudden, or crumbling and destruction of forms. And when that happens, that also can be quite sudden or gradual. Looking back now at the evidence of archaeology, we can understand why. Why those sudden transitions of extinction events followed by sudden efflorescence? All that resists, that refuses to evolve against this pressure of change, eventually breaks down. Eventually is rebuilt, reformed, replaced by the new possibilities. But the will pushing is unrelenting because the vision of what it sees, it is already, and nothing can come in its way. Nothing can prevent it. And time is only its domain of unfolding movement. Rhythms, therefore, rhythms in time of evolutionary cycles. Gigantic cycles of millions of years, and within that, smaller cycles of thousands of years, within that, little cycles of hundreds of years, and within that, our lifetimes, which are also cyclic, isn't it? So there is this massive evolutionary impulse that is the whole universe growing to its own diviner possibility. And within that are our little lifetimes, our cycles of birth and growth and change of form, what we call death, is nothing but a form that is now unable to keep up with the need of our evolution, of our aspiration. Sometimes the form crumbles, or we shed and replace and continue. Because there are rhythms, these little rhythms sometimes combine. And you have special events in history. Somewhere in Europe, there was the French Revolution. An ideal was felt, an ideal was attempted to be realized, and it seeded the whole world today. You notice every culture, every civilization, even every human being is touched by those ideals, lived in an intensity for a moment in history, a few years perhaps in human lifetime. Or somewhere in India, there was a great event that took place, or somewhere in China, or in Japan, or in the United States. We do not even remember those events, but they came and there was a burst of some possibility which rippled out to influence humanity. But all of these eventually combine and merge into something larger and larger. Inevitably, if you have a series of cycles, inevitably there will come a time when they were all synchronized to have one gigantic change. It is these which are the most important in human history or in the universe's history. Because now the little changes have built up to a great change, and the great changes have combined to a grand, a radical, not change, but leap. A leap of a new possibility. It is these radical leaps that we look back in history, well beyond recorded human history, and in the spiritual history of the world, we describe them as those events when the avatar came, the avatar manifests, the divine incarnates in human form to assist the radical change. Such is the present phase, the present period of human evolution, human change. A radical leap is in process, for which the last few thousand years have been a build-up. Little events, some of which we know in our recorded history, but all combining towards one grand leap. And so, the best of the past struggled to form and articulate itself, to realize itself, and all the best of the past efforts combined to reach their limit, beyond which they are unable to go, and they fail, but the impulse continues to leap beyond. And that is why the mother said, Sri Aurobindo is not the culmination of the past. It is not the best of the past combining and reaching an acme. Because that reaches an end of what it can be, stops, fails. But a greater beginning can now be initiated because of that best of the past having reached its limit. And Sri Aurobindo comes to initiate this new cycle, new birth, new age of humanity, a spiritual age. We'll take a few moments to explore this relationship of what that future is in relation to the past, but also what is Sri Aurobindo's special place in this transition. The acme of the past, the height was the highest possibilities of the human mind, the intelligence of which humanity is so proud, which distinguishes us from animals. Remove that, and we are not very different from the most sophisticated animals. And we would be ashamed to be compared to them. Bring this in, and we say, we are human. We are thinking beings. And all the greatnesses of all our civilizations are built on this one special power. But what is the greatest attainment of this power? Think about it. Yes, the technology, the science, the knowledge, the power that it has given to be able to seize on nature's processes, explore them, articulate them in your mathematics and symbolisms of physics and chemistry and so on. And then wield them to improve life, to change the face of the earth, even to destroy the balance of nature. All that is just by this single power. But what is the acme of this power? That's not the science. The acme, interestingly, the mother observes, is the power of the mind to deceive itself. Think about it. The mind can do so much, but it can deceive itself and convince itself of anything. That becomes the highest attainment. How far can that take you, really? And this is what we see today. in the grand failure of science to fulfill humanity's ideals. Barely 100 years ago, this is the time Sri Aurobindo had just finished writing the Arya. This was the time of the greatest excitement of the attainments of science and the power that it gave for us to recast human life, even the promise of finally we will bring about human peace. Because we will have the one weapon by which any opposition can be destroyed instantly, and so nobody will want to fight, and then we will have peace. Such were the various arguments. The power of the intellect is the power to convince itself of anything and justify it rationally, logically. And somebody with a completely different idea can justify with equal force and solidity of rational arguments. And what happens when you have two completely opposite but equally reasoned arguments? They collide. The result of the intellect is in fact a greater collision, more painful, more difficult to be free from, because each is backed by full justification of argument and evidence. And because the mind is essentially a power of finiteness, and reality and knowledge is infinite, you can have an infinity of finite arguments or positions. In principle, each human being can come with a rock-solid argument to justify whatever it is that is their fantasy or obsession or desire or purpose, and enter in total collision with everybody else. The promise of reason, of the intellect, is in fact a greater crisis, which is what we see happening today. And so the best of the past, culminating to its acme, only brings about a failure of the intellect. Fortunately, Sri Aurobindo represents not the best of the past, because the past could not give us that which we seek. Because the best of the past would be dissatisfying. It would be a complete failure of our ideals. What do we truly seek? We seek that perfection. We seek that complete freedom or a total power to be able to accomplish anything, to have a knowledge that is flawless, without error, a power to realize that which we know without any opposition, or to be able to overcome all oppositions. To be entirely free of all conditioning, to be able to be what we want to be and do what we want to do with nothing limiting us. And to be truly happy. But happiness is a pale reflection, the real thing we seek without knowing it, because we do not have the experience yet, and for which we don't have words, is really the bliss, the ananda of our origin, which secretly we remember as, that's how I should be. I should be happy. Why am I not happy? Something is wrong. All of these we seek in their ideal form, in their perfect way. Even though we have never experienced those ideal forms or perfections. Can you recall a time when you were perfectly happy? No, you can remember when you were very happy or most happy, but it was still not perfect. And you know it's not perfect because something inside you knows there is more possible. Or there's something missing. How does it know? Because it is already. It remembers what it is or what it was. So our deepest drives can never be satisfied by this reasoning mind and its capacities. But what will satisfy? Look within you, look around you, you will find nothing that can satisfy. Is it even possible? So if you look at all the equipment and powers and capacities and even things we can conceive of, we find nowhere evidence that these things, these ideals are possible, and so we can say, it's a pipe dream. It's a fantasy. It is a utopia, but by definition we mean by utopia something impossible to realize. And yet we dream of it. Sri Aurobindo explains that we dream of it because precisely we are meant to realize it. We are meant to realize it because we are it to begin with. That's our origin, not only our individual origin, it is the origin of the whole universe. It's the purpose for which the universe was born. It's the purpose for which we took birth and have been going through all these cycles of evolution. But just because we cannot find it in our existing knowledge and experience and even imagination does not mean that it is not there. It just means our current capacities of evolution and even imagination are insufficiently developed. And we have then to turn not to our mind's imagination, but our, I may use the word, soul's imagination. The deeper dreaming of this inmost part within us, and it is that dreaming which knows in the very dreaming, this is true, this must be, this I will realize one day, come what may. Or we would use a more technical term, our intuitive seeings. The soul's seeing is intuition, isn't it? And so when we set aside the limits of the intellect will still be our friend, we don't abandon it, but it must now become a tool, a servant for this deeper insight of the soul's seeing, of the intuition which must now lead us. What do we see? And what are the means by which we may realize? The means itself is the intuition, at least as a first step. But the intuition points to this, something which is omniscience, all-knowing, omnipotent, all-powerful, all-blissful, and yet truly free, immortal, permanent. And not a permanence of a monotone, a permanence of continual growth and progress and unending possibilities. Isn't it? Such is the sense we have. When you read Sri Aurobindo, one of the things which happens, he of course satisfies the needs of your reason, but he awakens this deeper intuitive memory, I will say. Because as you read, you say, yes, of course it's obvious, it must be like that. And why didn't I think of it before? He just articulated what I felt, but I never had words for. You feel that, isn't it? Because he's awakening within you this intuitive memory, the soul's memory. And then inspiring, pushing, activating, lighting up this aspiration. But he explains rationally the limits of the intellect stopping here. There is a greater power, of which the intellect was a derivation and a limited expression. And it is in that power and by that greater power that all these things which now seem to be utopian will be realized, and in the perfection that we dream of, that we feel intuitively possible. That power is capable of that perfection. And because it exists, the mind can function. Because it exists, the universe is so perfectly formed. Think about it. Even though we may take a single piece of the universe and say, this is not perfect, and we try to make it better and we never reach it. And yet if you look at the totality of the universe and the way everything moves in perfect harmony, in perfect synchrony, you have to wonder at the perfection of it all. And in the tiniest details, as if everything is perfectly synchronized. That perfection is the result of the working of this greater power, which Sri Aurobindo calls supra-mental, because it is beyond the mind. And we don't have a word for it. So we have to use mind as our reference, and then supra-mental. Sri Aurobindo affirms not only is this consciousness present, it is capable of being realized by us, but also that it is the intended next step in our evolution. And the failure of the mind in its acme is only intended to force us to seek for something higher. The intuition within us that points to those possibilities is the bridge that takes us into this next step, next grade of consciousness, which is also the origin from which everything derives. And it is in that, therefore, that we find the unification of all impulses, of all viewpoints, of all needs, of all desires. And recall our discussion earlier about the little pushes in every little atom. Well, they all are aligned here, because from here they burst out. This is the oneness from which the multiplicity emerges. This is the oneness into which the multiplicities find their harmony perfectly. No failure, no limitation, no distortion, utter freedom, blissful, immortal. The Vedic rishis exclaimed, "We are children of immortality." And it is to this that they pointed, because it is from here that our souls are born, and it is of this that the souls remember or hold a distant memory. And it is this which we secretly, unknowingly, blindly try to realize in every impulse of our life, in every desire, in every seeking. And while in the ascetic traditions it is desires are decried, criticized as things to be eliminated, the fact is it is the desires which have pulled us, pushed us, driven us to move forward towards this. And the true passage is not of abandonment of desire, but of removal of the confusion and the darkness and the blindness of desire. To recognize this is what the desire is seeking, and then to actively seek it in what we may call a divine desire, instead of just a passionate, chaotic, blind impulse that we call desire. And so Sri Aurobindo says, every impulse of life as it is, however limited it may be, however distorted, and however much it may create confusion, is actually secretly seeking this. And therefore, to realize this higher possibility, one does not have to abandon the existing life as the ascetic traditions demand. The ascetic traditions do not recognize the possibility of this higher consciousness. Seeing the failure of the mind, they conclude, well, this universe is worthless, this life is meaningless, this body is your trap, get out of it all. To merge into an origin which is not this. But the moment you realize that there is something greater, of which this is a derivation, and to which all this yearns, you do not have to abandon this, rather correct the distortions and lift the existing life into its next logical, inevitable step, the supramental. You see, the whole perspective of our life purpose changes. And therefore, Sri Aurobindo is not the culmination of the past, but the beginning of a new future. And it's the beginning that he establishes with this turn. The means that he gives to us and the right placement it makes of all of the past in relation to this future. But that's not enough. The leap is so great. It is, the mother says, at least as radical as the leap from the monkey to the human consciousness. And as we said earlier, you remove the intellect, you fall back to the monkey. Bring back the intellect, you're the human. It's a big leap, isn't it? And the leap from the human to this supramental is even bigger. How will the monkey become human? By imitating humans? Does not work. How will the monkey imagine what it's like to be a human? And if it were to sit through a exercise of, what do they call it, dream weaving or future forming, it would just imagine, oh, the human being will be will have a much bigger tail. Its muscles will be 10 times stronger. It will be able to eat 20 times more. That's all the monkey can think of, right? And so if the human beings sit down and say, what will this supramental being be like? Oh, he'll be much more intelligent, much stronger, more capable, and he'll be able to jump from one house to the next. And you have, by the way, the cartoons of Superman and Batman and Aquaman or whatever, isn't it? Aggrandized, exaggerated powers of the human intellect and strengths. That would be culmination of the human. That's not the beginning of the next step yet, isn't it? And so we have to cease to struggle with the intellect's imaging, but turn to the intuitions, the soul's seeing. And that's when we begin to glimpse what that could be like. It is the soul's sensitivity, refinement, perception, which has to now lead the intellect itself. The intellect, as I said, is not abandoned, it is reoriented. Not to justify itself or its knowings, but to serve the deeper soul's aspiration. And with that, step by step, one could make that effort. Difficult as we are humans, isn't it? Therefore, the need for someone who embodies and realizes that to be there to help humanity. Therefore, the need, as we see in all past such great radical transitions, the need for the avatar. The divine consciousness itself, which has to be realized, must itself incarnate in humanity as a human being, taking on the substance and with all the limitations of what the human being represents. Yet, through it, it must struggle to recover that which it is, and thus form a bridge from the human consciousness to the supramental, within the human consciousness. And yet, it should not be just him achieving this, which would be pointless. Everyone would say, here, out of the monkey, the human emerged. Wow. You worship him and go back to sleep. Doesn't help. He has to be able to connect to the mass of human consciousness and lift it with him as he makes this transition. Imprint into the mass that which he realizes within his individual consciousness. This is the role of the avatar. This was Sri Aurobindo's role. Sri Aurobindo came on earth to manifest this supramental consciousness and carve the way, build the bridge, the passage to link the human consciousness to the supramental. Individually within himself, but from within his consciousness, identified with humanity to form this bridge. And we can say this here openly. We might not necessarily say this in a different public setting where people might say, each one likes to praise their gurus. No, it's not that. Because you have to see the work that he did, for the work that he represents, the knowledge and the action which he manifested, and you see it is not merely a praise of one's guru. Or rather, one would accept him as a guru because of this work that he did. Otherwise, if we have a different interest, we will find many who represent those interests. And it does not even matter whether we recognize this or not. It does not matter whether we recognize that Sri Aurobindo attained to this. The work that he had to do was done, has been completed. His part of it. The way has been opened, the bridge has been formed, this new consciousness has been infused in humanity, and whether we recognize his role or not is not important. What we need to recognize is that this consciousness exists today within us as a subtle but a real presence and push, assisting us, lifting us, if we choose to align to it. But we may equally choose to align to our animal monkey impulses and drift towards our past monkeyhood, which also we see happening in humanity and pretty large parts of humanity, isn't it? where the whole intention is to follow your desire impulse and sink into animality. And if we choose to align to this deeper and higher impulse, we have also the lift that takes place, which carries us into this consciousness. Comes a very important point now. It's not just we individually, it's not just we collectively. Remember, it is a larger, universal, cosmic impulse. The divine will within every atom that is pushing in a sustained, irrevocable way, simultaneously everywhere. And therefore, the impulse is in nature. Nature herself has been preparing for this great leap, going back many thousand years. And so you will find in Sri Aurobindo's writings something quite extraordinary. And this was one of the declared objectives of his writings in the Arya. He said to look back at all the past traditions and draw from them that which is necessary for the future. Not everything is necessary. It was necessary then to make the step needed then. But sometimes those steps are no more required, or those forms which were useful then even become now impediments for the future, which is of a completely different character. And so to turn back, to take from the past that which has served humanity but has still relevance for the future. And so, and we will have time to discuss some of these writings of his, he turns to the Veda, some of the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, some of the ideals of the Tantras, draws from them those elements which correspond or which have relevance for this greater impulse and links them to this future. Not as a culmination of the past, but as a support and a base for an infrastructure, a foundation for the leap of the future. And so, all over in nature, there is a build-up for this great leap. And the mother, describing this, relates it to what happened when out of the monkey, the human being emerged. She said, in a few, the impulse became very strong. In those few, the consciousness rapidly grew, and that's what we call the missing link. And having rapidly grown, a transition made, the impulse and the urge in nature lapses and falls back. What you're left with was a little piece that rose and fell back, and the part that stayed up now continues as the human species. The link in between is lost. Something similar happens in human beings. In the parts of humanity where this yearning and aspiration grows, and there is a participation in this aspiration to realize it, there is a rising movement and a great leap that takes place. And then when nature is exhausted from her impulse, she lapses back. And a new species of a supra-humanity now continues. And it is articulated in this way. They speak of a new species of a superhumanity, living by this, in this supramental consciousness. And so we are at one of those extraordinary events, the likes of which has never happened before and will never happen again, in which we are going to actively, consciously participate in the awakening of a new species of humanity based on a new consciousness. And the realization of that consciousness is today the single most important thing. Sri Aurobindo dedicated his life not only to realizing this consciousness within himself, but as I said, infusing it, imprinting it into humanity. Everything that he wrote came from this higher consciousness. And as you read, it awakens you to this precisely because it resonates, it is suffused with the light of the supramental consciousness. But also at the same time, he formulated, articulated the means by which one could consciously accelerate this transition by a clear process of change of consciousness. a process, a yoga, for which he uses the name, an integral yoga. Integral because, unlike the ascetic traditions which abandon the body, suppress the emotions and kill the mind, the integral yoga takes up all of our nature, turns it to this higher possibility of divinization of human nature itself, which is the conclusion of this higher consciousness, but also can be achieved by the infusion of this higher consciousness. All is included, all is to be perfected, all is to be divinized, and therefore an integral yoga. But there's another reason why he uses this word also. The method of the yoga itself is not exclusive and partial, as most of the existing yogic traditions are. They take up one side of an impulse, nature, principle, or power and build on it, exaggerate it, intensify it to make a leap, but a partial leap. Here, all powers of our nature are taken up simultaneously in the comprehensive integral movement, and therefore the second reason for the use of the word integral. But there's a third reason also why he uses the word integral in integral yoga. The realization of this higher consciousness, or the divine consciousness, we may say generally, also can be had in many ways. Because the divine is not a oneness which is monotone, it is a oneness which is infinitely diverse. The divine can be realized in an infinity of aspects. And the mind could categorize those infinities of aspects into certain types, but still they are each an infinity of aspects. All of the existing religions or yogic systems aim at an aspect of the divine to be realized. And therefore you can even have the realization of one tradition saying God is silence. Someone says God is love. Someone says God is formless, non-existence, extinction. Someone says no, God is affirmation of all that is. And they all seem to even collide on their experience of the oneness which is the divine, because they each capture an aspect to the exclusion of all else. Because the approach itself is from a consciousness which is divisive and limiting. So it can only catch a limit and an aspect of the divine. So in the integral yoga, the goal is the realization of the divine as the divine knows itself in its infinities of oneness, in which all these different aspects of the divine experience are, facets or aspects of the oneness known in a supra-mental identification. You see, you could realize or glimpse the divine on any level of consciousness, and glimpsing through the mind, you catch a peace. To know the divine in the supramental consciousness, you are one with the whole. And so an integral yoga also has an integral realization. Something like this is unheard of in the best of the past of humanity. And here you see what it means that a completely new future has been initiated. In himself, Sri Aurobindo, having realized it, the prototype has been set. And it makes possible now for all of us to realize that. Each in our own way, perhaps. And a yoga system of yoga that is structured and yet flexible enough to adapt to the needs of all human beings is one of the gifts that he leaves us. But most of all, his active presence as the bridge linking these two consciousnesses is here with us today in the earth atmosphere. And again, it does not matter whether you recognize this particular form of the incarnation or not. He is, you don't have to give him a name. You may know him and recognize him in many different ways or forms or beyond all forms. I think it was a Christian mystic, Teilhard de Chardin, who also had a similar glimpse of spiritual evolution of humanity and a glimpse of a supra-humanity. But he was also conscious enough that he said, this is not my vision. I have got it from someone else. He was conscious of that. he didn't have a name, and it doesn't matter. What matters is that the bridge has been made and there is this active presence and help today for each one of us who chooses to participate in this leap. But not all humanity will choose, and that's also fine. But for those of us who choose, everything is here for us, given on a platter. Nature herself has built up this huge pressure of a leap, and so today the effort you make will have enormous results because everything in nature is pushing you to assist. It's like a gigantic tidal wave, and if you can ride the wave like a surf rider, you don't have to do much. The impulse in nature carries you. At the same time, there is this whole rich knowledge, literature, practice of the yoga and understanding of all that's happening around us, articulated in rational terms in so many of Sri Aurobindo's writings, of which we will have further explorations the next few days. Not only to understand what's happening within us individually as a psychology, what's happening socially, what's happening politically, what is the form in which this spiritual awakening within us will take in our collective life, in our polity, in humanity, in our society. What are the forms of culture and art, music, science, in which these would be reflected? All these he describes rationally, and yet not a reason that limits, a reason that articulates the soul's vision. And so helps us also to conceive, but also to realize this future. We have this help, and most of all, we have the active help of his presence. And so, in the history of human evolution, we are at the single most important moment with the single greatest possibility of progress for the single greatest leap in evolution that could ever be. Most interesting times. And I wouldn't be surprised that this would be the primary reason why so many of us have taken birth now, isn't it? It's as if the souls who aspire say, wow, I want to be here, I want to participate, there's so much to be achieved, there's so much I can do. Except in the leap into birth, we fall headlong into physical matter in a small, tiny baby brain, and the shock of that identification in the physical body stuns the mind and clouds the memory. And we wake up and say, what just happened? What did I come for? What's happening around me? And the rest of our childhood's journey is really trying to make sense of our world and then create partially true but mostly false ideas of what we should be doing or what our future should be and what is it that I'm going to do and what I will achieve and what I will be. And something inside says, yeah, that's not it. That's useful, but that's not it. But we are blind, we are deaf to the hearing of the soul's call. Yet bit by bit that little light manages to reach out, reflect in our thoughts and desires and emotions and nudges, guides us a little bit until such time as, sometimes through a shock, sometimes through a gradual awakening, we say, oh, that's what this is, life. That's what this is about. This is why I'm here. But I want that. And when that awakening takes place, we will say that's when our real birth is. There is a phrase in Sanskrit, Dvija, the twice born. That's our real birth. The first birth was the biology just coming into chaos and confusion. But then awakening out of that chaos to rediscover the purpose for which we consciously took birth is our real awakening. And then what do I do now? If Sri Aurobindo had not written, shared, expressed and lived all that he did, imagine what a world it would be like. So much confusion, so much chaos. And it's only when reading Sri Aurobindo, all these different disparate pieces, conflicting beliefs, systems, ideas, philosophies, they all just fall into place in this larger unity. And you say, wow, now it all makes sense, including your sense of purpose and including your means to realize. So this conference is intended to help us know something of all this. For those of us who feel, yes, there is something I want to do, well, the next few days is going to be a treat because you will get glimpses of all these different things. But always the underlying tone will be this unifying principle of the supramental and the disparate pieces seen in the context of this larger unity. Sometimes for understanding, sometimes for appreciating, sometimes just enjoying, and then for putting into practice in a way that we can change individually and all of us collectively. Sri Aurobindo is the underlying theme. The mother as the energy, the Shakti, the Divine Mother who gives birth to the universe, becomes the universe, nurtures us with her love and strength, who lives in us and carries us all along, is, well, the other side, the other aspect of Sri Aurobindo. Their presence will carry us during these days of exploration, introspection, and enjoyment and delight. So I think this would be a good introduction for what this conference is about, but also the theme which we had set for this part of the discussion, Sri Aurobindo's vision for the future, and Sri Aurobindo himself, his role in that future. We take a few moments to concentrate on this, realign with our aspiration, and prepare ourselves for the full participation and exploration of the next few days.